Okay, here we go then. Okay, and we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session, where we'll be joined by Dr. Jessica Flake, who will be giving a much anticipated talk on measurement. Just a quick few announcements before we start. We have back-to-back sessions today, this week. Today we have Jessica, and tomorrow the Right Science Club at the Erasmus Medical Centre in Rotterdam have a talk by Professor Stephen Cole, and he will be giving a talk on how do we ask better questions and get better answers, and that's at 2 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time. So please make sure that you put that in your diary as well. Nice way to finish your Friday afternoon. I'll just exit this and do a few more announcements before we get on to the main event. This is just the full calendar of events that's coming up in the next few weeks, if my computer decides to show the slide. Next week we have a talk by Gary in Buckingham, and then to finish off the year we have two talks, one from Malika, who will talk about reproducible research at Oxford, and then Louise Connell, who will talk about open data and ethics. You can, of course, find all of the videos from the talks that in the past on our YouTube channel. Make sure you like and subscribe to show support. You can stay in touch as well through our Twitter page, which you can find here. Apologies for the lag. And also you will find a link to our website as well, which can be found just in the profile of the Twitter. We do really value everybody's feedback. We want to make sure that we put on the best set speakers as much as possible. So I will put a link in the Q&A, which will be open throughout the talk, by the way. I'll put a link to a Google form, which will just ask people sort of for their feedback about the talks and any suggested speakers for the future. Okay, so anyway, enough of me. Let me go back to our speaker today. So I have a brief little script here. So Dr. Flake is a member of the Departments of Psychology at McGill University, where she looks at quantitative psychology and modelling. Her and her group are working on developing best practices for the use of latent variable models in psychological measurement. Their measurement research spans from technical to the applied. Technical research working on developing rigorous and transparent research practices for measurement, development and use models for assessing measurement equivalence, handling clustered data structures, and addressing measurement challenges in replication research. And their applied work is looking at the advances to study students' achievement, motivation and success, as well as how they perceive other faces as well. So we're really excited to have Jessica today. So Jessica, you can now start sharing your slides, if that's okay. And today Jessica will give a wonderful talk on measurement, and a great title too, Measurement. Wonderful. Okay, so I'll hand the keys over to you. Okay, Jessica, if you...
Okay, I should be perfect. Unmuted now. Yeah, I had to get rid of presentation mode so I can get the unmute button. So hopefully you can hear me and you can see my screen.
Yeah, we can, yeah.
All right, perfect. Okay, little test of a question mark. Could you see that?
Yeah, okay. All good.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you for having me. This is my first time giving a talk like this, where it's live and with this format. So if I seem like I don't know what I'm doing, that's because I don't. I will add a little pointer, which might help. Okay. So the agenda for my talk is that I'm going to explain what Schmeasurement is, and then I'll define questionable research practices and give you some tips for how to avoid them. So no more of a formal outline slide than that. But before I do that, I think that it's nice, a lot of people in their career take different paths. So I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. Like some of you may have been, I was a psychology major at Northern Kentucky University. I'm a rare creature from Kentucky. That's a real place. And I did an area of concentration in statistics. I got really interested in statistics and quantitative methods, and I didn't know anything about grad school. So I did a master's in quantitative psych. For me, I had to get a grad degree to understand how to get a grad degree. And that really helped me figure out that I was interested in measurement, how you measure things, and the quantitative methods that go into measuring things. And so I did my PhD in measurement at the University of Connecticut, actually in educational psych. Now I'm back in quantitative psych as an assistant professor at McGill, but I also did a postdoc at York University in quantitative psych. So my research focuses on measurement, and measurement has really two big aspects, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. A part of measurement is really advanced quantitative methodology, but a part of measuring something well is theory and theoretical. So in my more methodological work, which Sam mentioned a little bit, I look at latent variable models, structural equation, and multi-level models for assessing measurement variance or measurement equivalence. And I'm particularly interested in complex data structures. So you've got many groups, clustered data structures, dependencies in the data, that sort of thing. In my more substantive or theoretical work, I just try to put some of these methods to the test. I've done work in achievement motivation to develop scales and model motivation and in-person perception. But today I'm going to talk about my more meta-scientific research on trying to understand what practices are and develop best practices for measure use. But in the Q&A, if you want to ask me about some of my other work, I'm happy to speak to that. This talk is a little bit more workshopish. I'm just going to be explaining concepts and giving you examples more than talking about, a formal research study the whole time. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is what do I mean by measurement, and importantly, what do I mean by Schmeasurement? So I think, if you work in psychology and try to do research, you know that measurement is hard and it's complicated. So in psychology, we're in this position where we make up concepts and we think that they're real. We think that people experience them, and we try to develop a way to understand what that experience is. So if you think about something like personality, it seems like a truth that personality is a thing, but psychologists made up the concept of personality, and we try to extract, these feelings or attitudes or ideas that are in people's head and create a number that ultimately ends up in our data set. And there's a lot of methods and theories for how to do that. It's not straightforward. We make up some concept and then we have to figure out how to put a number on it. And the assumption really is that the number represents something meaningful. So I've developed a scale of student psychological cost, and I assume that if the numbers are higher on that scale, that students are experiencing more psychological cost. There's a lot of ways to think about measurement. There's an official standards for educational and psychological testing, which focuses on clinical, educational, and workforce assessments. But we have to develop assessments for our research as well, and there's a lot of ways to think about that. There's various approaches to test theory, psychometric methods. This was the book that I learned with an introduction to methods, but this is the book that pops up in IRT class, or structural equation modeling. My measurement professor recently wrote a book. So we know it's hard and complicated because it takes all these textbooks and a lot of different great minds to try to figure it out. And that's because measurement really is this integration of two key aspects of psychological research. So a part of it is theory. If you're going to measure something, you have to understand it. You have to have a sense of what it is and how it works. But a big part of it is also methodology, factor analysis, multivariate methods. And we know that we need a theory to develop a measure, but we also know that our measurements come back and they help us develop theory. Measurement, how we want to measure and what we want to measure, helps us determine what kind of methodology we could use, but our methodology also goes back into how we measure. So this isn't just zooming into one little quantitative method or zooming into one little theory. When you're thinking about measurement, you're thinking about this complex integration of theory and of process. But I'm not really going to talk a lot about that integration because I'm going to talk about Schmeasurement instead of measurement. So despite that we have all these, textbooks and quantitative methods and theories of validity and this concept of construct validity, that we should have some evidence that we're measuring what we think we're measuring, that the number on the page actually has the meaning that we think that it has. This idea has been around, since the 50s, so it's not new. But in some of my metascientific research and research that I've read by others, we're seeing that the published literature, in some of our best journals, features measures that have no or little validity evidence. So that applied researchers aren't, as a norm, engaging with this process of construct validation. So I'm going to talk about some of my work today, but I do want to recommend, that everybody, metascience is a way for us to think about our research practices so that we can improve them. And I think as a methodologist, this is something that, like me and my community, we could do more of. The most recent resource that I know of about measurement practices is in Kate Slaney's recent book, Validating Psychological Construct. She has a chapter about measurement practices in the trenches, and it's the most up-to-date review. But I'll be honest, metascience and our measurement practices, particularly measures in use, is pretty scant. There haven't been a lot of review studies about how all of these construct validation theories and methods get put into practice by applied researchers. But some things we do know is that measures without any validity evidence are common in the published literature. Measure modification without justification is common. And using reliability as a single indicator to sort of represent the validity of the scale is a common practice. I'm going to dig into these points a little bit more by telling you about a study that I did. If we're going to think about practices, improving practices in open science, social psychology is a good case study. They're easy to pick on. So I did a review of papers published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And this wasn't a very big review, but it took hundreds of hours because papers in this journal are so long. We took a stratified random sample of papers published in 2014, and that ended up being 35 articles. So we did about a third of them. And we found that there are 700 instances of measures in that sample. And most of the measures, 87%, are item-based scales. So these are the kinds of measures that all of that construct validation and psychometric literature is really aimed at addressing. And you can think about measurement of physiological measures, tasks that you do in the lab. But in JPSP, most of the measurements are actually like surveys and questionnaires. And a good chunk of those surveys and questionnaires are single item questions. And when I say that it's common to use measures without any validity evidence, I'm talking about this pie chart here. So what we saw is that of those item-based scales, 40% of them were used in the paper without any reference to where they came from. So an example of this is we used 5 items to measure self-esteem, and it doesn't say that the authors developed it or provide a citation. 7% explicitly said we developed this measure. So it's very common for what some consider to be a premier journal in this area for there to be measures and scales used, questionnaires that have no source and they don't appear to be previously developed at all. Okay, you're like, all right, well, maybe they just developed them and they're going to provide some information about how well they perform, some evidence that they're actually measuring what they say they're measuring, some validity evidence. So if the scale had a citation, so this is the case where the scale had a citation, the most common thing for authors to report is a reliability coefficient. It's not uncommon for there to be no extra information. So an example of this is we used Rosenberg's self-esteem scale, that's all. An example of this is we used Rosenberg's self-esteem scale, reliability, Cronbach's alpha equals 0.76. In the case of these scales that are new or made up by the authors, I refer to these like on the fly scales, you still have a sizable chunk that will not report any additional information. So we used 5 items to measure self-esteem. And that's all the information that you get. But most frequently is we used 5 items to measure self-esteem, alpha equals 0.82. So that when I say that the reliability coefficient alpha is sort of like replacing the whole process of construct validation, this is what I'm referring to. So I'm a quantitative psychologist, right? I'm supposed to not just read people's papers and calculate frequencies and make pie charts. So I looked at all the reliability coefficients. If reliability is the only thing we have when we present evidence for measures, then why don't we take another look? So I did a multi-level model looking at the reliability coefficients nested within the articles. It was needlessly complicated. Really, I just needed this box plot. So these are the reliability coefficients that from all the scales that had more than 3 items. These are the scales with no citation, and these are the scales with a citation. And you can see, we often say we want a p-hack to get the p-value less than 0.05. We definitely do this, with reliability. We want the reliability coefficient to be around 0.8. And so you see on average, it's around 0.8. But even though this is most of the information that we get about measures, you see plenty of reliability coefficients that a lot of people, and this is 0.17, would be like, wow, that's concerning. That's a really low reliability coefficient. It could be that this reliability coefficient isn't appropriate for the measure. I've seen a lot of different things. So it's not like we're killing it in the reliability coefficient category. And just, as a reminder, or for those who might not know, the most frequent approach to reliability is an alpha coefficient. And an alpha coefficient quantifies the consistency of the items, basically how correlated they are. It doesn't tell you anything about whether or not the scale measures what you think it measures. You could have a very, very consistent scale that doesn't, from a content perspective or theoretical perspective, capture what you want to measure at all. So it's kind of taking the place of all possible validity evidence, but it doesn't actually provide any information on validity. Those are just some sort of like the reporting highlights that really got me thinking about this Schmeasurement attitude. But beyond the results, there's just, whenever if you guys engage in a metascience project, maybe you'll have this sort of like come to Jesus type of experience. Like a lot of my other research is on quantitative methods, and I realized that nobody cares about that. Like there's some basic things going on in the literature that need addressing. And the more of these papers you read, whether it's for a meta-analysis or a systematic review or a metascience project, you develop certain impressions. And for me, what I just personally realized is that this on-the-fly measurement thing is a norm. And because there's so many measures that are just kind of made up on the fly, there's also a lot of cavalier item addition and removal. It's really common. In JPSV, for example, there's a lot of different studies. On average, there were 4 studies in a paper to just totally change up scales, add and remove items across studies, changing the measures of the same construct across studies. So seeing that self-esteem is measured with one scale in study 2, but it's measured with a different scale in study 3, and it's measured with a combination of those 2 scales in study 4. Breaking and combining measures, sometimes where they're the same measures of the same construct, but sometimes where they're measures of totally different constructs. And these practices, they're not isolated to this one review. My lab has reviewed all of the measures that were used in the reproducibility project psychology and all the measures used in the mini labs 2. The mini labs 2 review is published now. Mairead Shaw, my graduate student, is the lead author on that. And we see the same issues. A lot of on-the-fly measurement, a lot of measure modification without justification. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but it really complicates replication when you have this going on. So this is really what got me thinking about wanting to shine light on this issue of this sort of like cavalier or Schmeasurement attitude. Because when our measurement decisions lack justification, it's really difficult to determine if the scales measure what you think they're measuring, and that calls into question the entire conclusion of the study. There's really broad implications of measurement. I'm not talking about just some little methodological detail that doesn't span out to the rest of the study. So In Shadish, Cook, and Campbell's seminal book on research design, it has a sort of causal inference approach. If you haven't seen this textbook before, they talk about how you can think about the validity of the conclusion and determine threats to validity with like 4 different categories of validity. So measurement can influence every single one of those categories, not just sort of the construct validity category that we tend to think about. So I'll walk through a few examples. So the first validity they talk about is statistical conclusion validity. Statistical conclusion validity concerns the results of statistical tests, and it's compromised if you didn't meet assumptions, or you're not adequately powered, or you p-hack. And I think the most obvious is that we understand that you can p-hack using the measures. You can use measurement flexibility to p-hack, which biases the p-value, it biases the conclusion. Construct validity, this idea that you think you're measuring something, but then you're not. That's the most relevant to measurement. But even external validity is relevant to measurement. So say you designed a study and you use really population-specific measures, and your sample doesn't understand the measure in the same way. The measure itself doesn't generalize, or the measure is so specific and the sample is so specific that your ultimate findings don't generalize. And this sounds like, oh, you're kind of making a stretch there, Jess, but when we think about large-scale replication and the translation of measures, this is where external validity and measurement really interact they could undermine the validity of the conclusion. And then finally is internal validity, which really focuses on experimental design features that can help you to make causal claims or undermine causal claims. And even there, with certain treatments and certain treatment and control conditions, you could have treatment conditions interact with measurement in a way that biases the conclusion of the study. So I'm not talking about, just one little problem in a study that's very isolated. I'm talking about how when we don't really take measurement seriously, it can cause problems in a really broad way with the validity of our conclusions. So you can, alternatively, you could think about how when we think about reform and open science and replication and wanting to improve practices, what we really want to do is make the validity of our conclusions stronger. And a lot of what we talk about, which I think is very important, is statistical practices. Ways to increase our power, ways to limit our analytical flexibility so that our p-values aren't biased. But that, or more foundational to that, are things like measurement, design, philosophy of science, theoretical expertise. And so when you think about a lot of open science practices or methodological reform, it really focused on statistical practices to decrease p-hacking and selective reporting, the questionable research practices. And so I'm just trying to encourage people to take some of those ideas about transparency and move them down so that we can think about how transparency, p-hacking, but also validity is challenged when the measurement aspects of our study are not in very good shape. You can imagine, if you think about this as being directional, that even if you do a great job with all of your statistical practices, if you've got problems here, it won't solve that. Any measurement problems can't be fixed by better statistical practices. And replication doesn't solve the problem either. So replication is something that we think of as a way to improve science so we can figure out, what's true and what isn't. But if you have problems with measurement, replications become, pretty befuddling. So say you replicate a study, if you have, a quality measure with a lot of validity evidence, okay, great. But if you replicate a study and the measures weren't measuring what the study was supposed to be investigating, what does that even mean? Like, what did you actually replicate? So that's just confusing. If you fail to replicate, which that's a big emphasis in the reform movement, is trying to understand why studies don't replicate. There's a lot of things you can think through. If you have measures with a lot of validity evidence, you can kind of rule measurement out, and then you can think about theory failure or hidden moderators or power, or they didn't run the study right or whatever. But if you have poor measurement in the replication study, it's always there as a potential reason for the failure to replicate. And it becomes really difficult to rule that out in addition to these other interpretations that a lot of people really lean on when they talk about failed replication. I think we could do a lot more of thinking about, well, how the measurement aspects of the study might have led to a failed replication, instead of just theory failure or the person p-hacked or some of the conversations that really seem to be the focus. So the solution really is to take a lot of the transparent practices that we have been working on that really focus on our downstream statistical analysis and move them into the measurement parts of the study. So I think that if we're more proactive and rigorous, we sort of stopping like, ooh, Schmeasurement, we can eliminate a lot of threats to validity and ultimately like improve the conclusions of the study. So hopefully I've convinced you of that. I'm going to transition now to, putting a name on this, defining it, so that you can figure out what to look for. And usually when I give this talk, it's more like a workshop with a lot of back and forth between these sections. So if you've got a question or an idea from the last section, feel free to put it in the Q&A area now, and at the end we can address it. I don't want to like skip over those good thoughts. But okay, so what do I mean by questionable measurement practice? I'm saying that questionable research practices, they include these measurement things. What are questionable measurement practices? So questionable measurement practices are decisions that researchers make, and they raise doubts about the validity of the measure use in the study and ultimately the study's final conclusions. So there's some doubts going on because some information is lacking. And when I say measurement, I mean any method that's used to come up with a number that represents a variable. So my business is sort of like questionnaires and surveys because of my methods focused on structural equation modeling with like factor analysis and stuff. But other measures, there's physiological measures, there's task measures. So you can be questionable with all types of measures. It doesn't have to be surveys, even though that's kind of like what I'm focusing on because that's what I know about. And then the decisions or the choices that researchers make to come up with that variable of interest. So the reason that there are doubts, the reason that questions, that QMPs arise is because there's some justification and transparency lacking. And when I say justification, I just mean that there's a reason, what are the reasons for the decisions that you made, and that those decisions are transparently reported, how you made them in the final paper, such that readers can ascertain them. So a questionable measurement practice could be evidence for p-hacking or fraud or data manipulation or theory failure, but we don't know for sure. This is just like with QRPs. You're not quite sure. You think something's going on, but you don't know if it's sort of intended to mislead the reader, if it's an accident, if it's just a lack of reporting. But what we do know is that when you're missing a lot of information about the measures, it's difficult or impossible to really do a thorough job at evaluating the validity of the conclusion and thinking through these different types of validity. And it's certainly going to make it even harder to reproduce or replicate the work when a lot of the critical information about measurement is missing. Though, there's this tension with transparency that transparency doesn't like automatically make measurement better. So if you are really transparent and you report all this information about all of your measures, it'll just be easier for me or for a reviewer or for a reader to be like, wow, your measure is hot garbage, like get it out of here. So it's not like transparency automatically makes the validity, like eliminates the threats to validity. It just makes it easier for us to evaluate them. And I know it's sort of like we're telling people to give us more information so we can shoot them down. But that's how transparency facilitates rigor. It helps us gatekeep in a way that's better and maintains, the rigor of science. So I'm asking you to give us more information about your measures so that we can figure out if they're hot garbage, because if they're hot garbage, we don't want that in the literature. I know that sort of sucks, but I think that's just what we have to do as good citizens and as good scientists. But I don't want to make this more complicated than it is, so really, you know what a QMP is, like when you're reading a paper and you're like, what is going on here? Why did they do that? I call this like getting your p hackles up. You're reading a paper and you're like, something just isn't right here. This happens with measures too. And if you read measures sections really closely, you're going to have this experience. You're going to have questions. This is like the process of becoming measurement woke or whatever. You're going to start to realize like that you're not sure where the items came from. Well, how many items were there? How did they decide to create those subscales? You might wonder, like, didn't they use a different subscale to measure the same thing in the last study? Or, why are we mixing and matching items across different scales? This is what I mean by a QMP. You don't know why things are happening, and there's no validity evidence to help you understand why or justification. Some people might do this on purpose, but it's also really easy with measurement because there are so many decisions to make to get lost in this like garden of forking measurement paths. You're in the garden whether you realize it or not. It's just like a statistical analysis. And I think, this might be obvious to people that this is like a really easy way to p-hack is to use your measures. A lot of times, especially in a journal like JPSP where a lot of measures are collected, people measure a lot of different sort of similar constructs with slightly different measures. And so they're like, okay, well, look at our effect on scale 1. Okay, not significant. All right, well, I'll remove some of those bad items. All right, still not significant. Well, we collected that other scale. It's like sort of similar. Well, I'll look at the sum score. I don't even know if I should have used a sum score. I'll do a PCA. Oh, okay, one of the components is like pretty close to being significant. Let me sit that down, look at the third scale. Okay, you know where I'm going here. Well, I'll add all the scales together. People do that all the time. Okay, well, I'll break all the scales apart into their tiniest, smallest pieces, which is the, why people might love the use of the one item scale. And oh, look, the effect is significant. It's easy to wander into this situation because there's so many different ways to use measures, analyze them, select them, and score them. And if you have no plan, it makes it really easy to get lost in the garden of forking paths, and it facilitates questionable measurement practices. Because what's the justification for doing that? I mean, you're not going to want to report that in the paper and be like, well, I didn't know what I was doing and I didn't have a plan, so I analyzed it all different ways. That's not going to sound good to anybody. So QMPs occur when you don't report all of those things, and you're more likely to get in a situation where you don't want to report all those things because you didn't have a plan to begin with. And I mean, you guys, I don't want to make it sound like I'm like pointing the finger at everybody and telling them, oh, you're doing a bad job. I think, we could use a support group for people who got lost in the garden of forking paths. So I'll go first, I'll share. Back when I was a grad student, my advisor told me to do some quality checking of the scales, motivation scales that we had collected as a part of an online survey of students' motivation. And I didn't know what I was doing, so we had asked an attention check question, like, select strongly agree if you're reading this question. So I was like, okay, I'll analyze that. And so I analyzed that and I looked at the correlation with the outcome and I was like, okay. But then I realized like, well, I also had information about how long people spent taking the survey. And I was like, I should definitely kick people out if they spent like less than 5 minutes in the survey. But I should probably also kick people out if they spent like 2 hours in the survey. Like, what were they doing? Chugging a beer? And so then I looked at the correlation again, and it was like slightly different. And then I was like taking multivariate statistics at the time, and I was learning about how to identify multivariate outliers of Mahalanobis distance. And so then I calculated Mahalanobis distance for all the participants, and I excluded some. And I was just totally lost, and I had a slightly different result for every single one. So this happens to everybody, and it happens more when you don't have a plan. And like me, you don't know what the hell you're doing. So I'm going to transition now to giving you a little bit more concrete guidance on how to avoid this situation. First, though, I should say is that at this point, you might be like, oh, I really want to make sure my measures have strong validity evidence. How do I create a good measure with strong validity evidence? Unfortunately, I'm just like not going to talk about that. This is a table that overviews the whole process with a lot of references. Obviously, you can't read that right now, but when I share the slides, you'll be able to see the link to this table. And Eiko Fried and I should really give a shout out to Eiko Fried, who the reason these slides look so good is because a lot of the content was developed for workshops that we've given at SIPS. So I'm stealing a lot of the content that we co-developed, but we also developed a resource list. If you're really interested in learning more about measurement, I mean, you could do a PhD in measurement like I did, or you could read this resource list. And each of these sections has multiple papers under it, and we've actually starred ones that we in particular think are good for like getting started. I'm not really going to talk about how to make a good measure. I'm going to talk about how you're in the situation, you're thinking about measuring some things in the study. How can you avoid questionable measurement practices? So the best way to avoid it is to have all of the information and justify all of the decisions that you made regarding the measures. And this is to facilitate readers in evaluating the validity of the study in a really comprehensive way. So if there are no lingering questions, there are no questionable measurement practices. So in our paper, Aiko Fried and I's paper, we go through specific questions that researchers can answer. So the first question is, what is your construct? Like, what are you actually trying to measure? What is it? Does it exist? What's the causal process or the set of processes that lead to the response? What's the theory underlying the construct? You know, how wide is the construct? How deep is the construct? Like, there's a nebulous cloud of all possible constructs. Where is it in that cloud? This is really the substantive phase of the research process, that when you were thinking about your study in the first place, you were theorizing, and you can incorporate really thinking deeply about your constructs into this aspect of the research process. And importantly, once you sort all of that out, you should take time and space to explain that in your paper. I've conducted other reviews within theoretical areas of motivation measures, and there's a lot of big theorizing of motivation, but then when you want to get down to the actual constructs and specifically connect them to the measures, it's like no text, no space. So take some space to talk about the theory, what causes the response to the question. And generally the way that these slides are structured is that there's a few questions you can consider, and then the orange box is like the brass tacks, like what should you actually put in your paper? So I'll go through the other ones. So why and how did you select measures? So once you have this construct theory figured out, you can select measures more thoughtfully. So why did you choose one measure over another? What previous evidence exists for the measures? And are there similar constructs with different names, or different constructs with similar names that you should be thinking about? It's sort of a big ask, but I really hope that as a research community and as people thinking about scientific reform and transparency, that we can be more proactive about issues of jingle jangle in the literature. So jingle jangle is a set of fallacies. The jingle fallacy is thinking two different constructs are the same just because they have the same name. So an example of that, Aiko, if he were here and we were giving a workshop, he would talk about depression, how there's all these depression scales, but when you look at individual scales, they measure such wildly different symptoms that those two measures aren't actually measuring the same thing. Jangle is when you think two of the same constructs are different just because they have different names. I'm not going to weigh in on the debate, but a pretty high profile debate of this would be like grit and conscientiousness. They say they're two different things, but they seem to correlate a lot. They seem to cover some of the same theoretical space. We can be more proactive about this because jingle causes confusion in the literature, and it creates difficulty in knowledge accumulation. So you can imagine you think you understand the effect of depression or the effect on depression, but if depression is always a slightly different thing across studies, how can we actually accumulate any knowledge about it? It becomes a really difficult challenge. And jangle contributes to the proliferation of unnecessary constructs. And who wants that? This is a huge issue in my area of research and motivation research. So the brass tacks thing that you can do is cite and describe the existing measures and their evidence. Explain construct similarities or differences if they're relevant. Spend some space in your paper telling us why your measure is worth a damn. Okay, so you've got some theory, you've selected a measure. Really get into the details of how the construct was operationalized with your measure. So what's a construct definition? Like the actual definition that's going to connect to the way it's measured. And how does the theory connect with that definition? There can be really big leaps made from theory to construct definition to measurement. And if you map your theory to your definition and to your measurement approach, that alignment can really help with the construct validity of your study. So mapping constructs to measures, you don't want things to fall into the cracks. I've certainly reviewed scale development papers, which is a really big idea, big theory, and then they're measuring and you read the items and the items don't really appear to measure that at all. That's where you get into these pretty serious validity issues. And it sounds like, okay, this is pretty easy. I'll map my measures to constructs. Like, it's obvious. What does it matter if I don't? Well, you can imagine if you've collected a lot of similar measures and you haven't explicitly mapped your constructs to your measures and to your theory, at the end of the day, it becomes really easy to start mixing things, combining things, splitting them apart. That theoretical distinction and definition can really guide you in making a plan so you don't get lost in the garden of forking measurement paths. if you get lost in the garden of forking measurement paths and you've got a lot of similar, slightly different, conceptually fuzzy measures, not only are you in p-hacking territory, but you also don't know if the numbers like represent anything meaningful. And just from to facilitate replication and reproducibility, what is the actual measure? I mean, I know this seems obvious, but if I wanted to replicate your study, what would I need? So cite the measure, describe the measure, like how many items or stimuli, how the measure was administered, what the response options are. Sharing your materials can answer a lot of these questions. So then once you've got a measure, you need to think about how to quantify your measure. So, you give people questions or you give people a task. There's some work on the back end to come up with that number that's going to end up in the data set. So how did you transform any responses, or did you exclude certain response patterns? How many items or stimuli are there per score? And how do you actually calculate the score? Is it like the sum of all the items divided by the number of the items? Or is it like the sum of all items divided by the number of the items minus the mean of item 2? I've seen some crazy things. And did you perform any psychometric analyses to make decisions to help quantify your measure? You can answer a lot of these questions by keeping your analysis code tidy, reporting the analysis and calculation steps to making the score happen. So this is something that when we think about open data and open code, a lot of times when you see open data and open code, it's like it's already all processed. So if there are subscale scores, they're in the data, and the analysis code sometimes really just focuses on the primary analysis of the effect. I would like to see all the steps to getting those subscale scores. So the item level data where you can reproduce or conduct any psychometric analyses on the data. So I have one more question left, and I'm kind of like taking a little bit of a pause to make sure it's clear that like this issue of having no validity evidence creates confusion, integrates or facilitates p-hacking, and could just result in garbage. So this issue of construct validity and p-hacking, they're really connected. So if you use measures that have a validity study, the validity study prevents p-hacking because it tells you what to do. So the validity study, it's like a 20-item questionnaire. They did a factor analysis. They realized what items go to what factors. They've done some reliability analyses. They've done some content analyses. It gives you a guide about how to score the instrument. You're going to make these items go to these factors. You expect these to be reliable. When you don't have any validity evidence and you just like make up your scales, you lose all of that, and then you have to make a plan. And certainly planning ahead prevents p-hacking, right? We know that. I mean, this is where the measurement stuff really just is classic case p-hacking. And if you pre-register, you can prevent p-hacking, and that's going to help you with your statistical conclusion validity. But it's not going to help you with your construct validity. Even if you don't p-hack, your measure could still not be very good. It might not capture what you think it's capturing. It will kind of keep you from getting lost in the garden of forking paths in your study. But you could imagine when there's no validity evidence, like you pre-register and you make a plan, but then the next researcher comes along and they make a slightly different plan. So everybody's got their own pre-registered plan, but it can still introduce measurement heterogeneity because there's no validity evidence or published guide for how to use the measure. When you have measurement heterogeneity in a field, like I think, I'm making this sound complicated, but I think if you look at measures in your field and you start looking at how they're used, and they're all used in slightly different ways in every study, that can really introduce effect heterogeneity. And then we don't know, is it because the measure is different, or is it because the theory is different? So even if you pre-registered all your studies and all your measures, and everybody pre-registered the exact same thing, and they use the same measure, if it doesn't have any validity evidence, it could still be hot garbage. So this issue of no validity evidence can interact with flexibility to really create the worst situation, and taking away the flexibility solves part of the problem, but not all of the problem. So if you were to answer the past questions really with a lot of evidence and plan ahead, you'd be like in the best position because you'd have a lot of validity evidence to offer and you would have not p-hacked. And you can do part of the way or you can do all of the way. So the final question is, did you modify your measures or just make it up? So I've been talking about this situation where, when you modified your measures or you just made them up, you're really in the worst case scenario because you have no validity evidence and you could accidentally get lost in the garden of forking paths. or you could be nefarious, trying to take over the world and do it on purpose. But it happens, we need to modify scales sometimes. It can be very justified. I've done it. So if you modified this measure, why did you modify it and how did you modify it? I think this is also a huge issue in lab tasks and behavioral tasks. These modifications seem small, but when it comes to a corpus of research, it's like everything's modified so much you don't even know if it's comparable. And if you just made up a measure, why didn't you use an existing measure? Why did you use your measure? Just keep in mind that modified and new measures, they have little validity evidence. You can gather some validity evidence as a part of your study, or you can report it as a limitation. Not everybody can go through the whole validation process for every measure in their study. Every study has threats to validity, but it's okay to say this is a limitation, this is a next step, this is something that we need to be thinking about. At minimum, you want to describe all modifications and when they occurred. Did the modifications occur before data collection or after data collection? And you want to justify all the modifications. You don't want people to be like, what? You don't want that p-hackles feeling to be happening to your readers. And you want to report any evidence that you have that you're measuring what you think you're measuring. You might do a psychometric analysis. You might just examine the content. I don't think, face validity isn't nothing, it's something. But being more thoughtful about that can go a long way. So in closing, the big picture point is that the measurement process and aspects of the study are really at the foundation. And if they're poor, they can trickle all the way up and threaten the validity of the conclusion. If we're transparent about those decisions, it allows us to evaluate the validity more rigorously and more comprehensively. And we know that not all studies can rule out all threats to validity. There's always going to be some threats, and I think it can be overwhelming to be like, oh my God, now I have to think about this. It's okay, your study doesn't have to be perfect. You just have to report everything so that reviewers in the field can help you figure out where to improve it when absolutely necessary. That's how transparency facilitates rigor. But again, it's a necessary first step. It's not, the end all be all for making our studies better. Also, I just want to thank my co-authors on the review paper, Eric Heyman and Joel Peck. And actually, you can see this is a really old slide because Eric is at McGill now, and Iko Fried. And then I've certainly been talking about a lot of ideas that I've developed with my lab. And here's just a picture of us hanging out in the garden. And now I will open it up for Q&A. And I guess I should maybe not share my slides anymore.
Thank you, Jessica. That was an absolutely fantastic talk. Yes, you can stop sharing your screen if you like. So the message board has been lighting up. So let me prioritize these. So if people in the audience, if you can upvote questions that you would like answered, that would be great. So we can prioritize. So the one that with the most votes so far is, so your talk focuses on scales and self-report measures in general, but are the problems you raise applicable to cognitive and behavioral measures?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a big problem. I'm not working on that problem, but in the questionable measurement practices paper, we do cite flexible measurement website that shows this aggression measures and quantified hundreds of ways, and it's slightly different every study. So I can't really speak to the theoretical and validity evidence for those measures, but I certainly know that the analytical flexibility aspects of it are a pretty big problem. And I think that that's probably a situation where thinking about the validity and the reliability, there's probably methodological work that can be done to address those issues. And it also has the same issues of transparency and p-hacking that the regular scales and surveys have. So I can't give you the solution, but I do agree. I agree that it's a problem, and I think that some researchers are taking an interest in going into their own areas and figuring out what are the specific kind of measurement methodological challenges we have in our area, and where are we not being transparent enough. And I think that's definitely an area that needs work.
Right, absolutely. I'm quite mindful of Sam Parsons, who's I think written a preprint on this quite recently about sort of improving reporting practices for cognitive measures.
Yeah, he gets credit for asking me that question years ago, and then going and trying to answer it himself.
Okay, well, I'll save the person who job who asked the question here. Okay, so the next one is, let me just read this. So I've seen and heard people recommend using McDonald's omega rather than Cronbach's alpha. However, the difference between each is not clear to me. Please, could you explain the differences between each coefficient in relatively simple terms?
Okay, so it's like a quiz, like measurement test time. Well, so versus omega, you do need a factor model to calculate an omega coefficient. So the idea behind both alpha and omega is that you're measuring one thing. That's an assumption of it. It doesn't really make sense to calculate one reliability for multiple things. So you're measuring one thing, and you want to know how consistent the responses are to items within a person as opposed to between people. So you could think about it like a variability ratio. So, I'm a person, I answered your measure, it's just one thing, that assumption is shared across both coefficients, and I'm really consistent within myself. Okay, but Sam goes, he answers the measure, he's really consistent within himself, but he's different from me. That's the ideal reliability situation. So you could think of a Cronbach's alpha as the proportion of within a person variability to between person variability. And what we really want is all the variability to be between people. Alpha quantifies for that for us. And it assumes that you're measuring the same thing and that all the items measure the construct equally well. Or if you're familiar with factor analysis, all of their loadings are equal. That's an assumption of alpha. Omega just relaxes that second assumption a little bit, and it helps you calculate this proportion of variance between, but that with different loadings. So maybe some items are more strongly associated with the construct than others. And it just happens to be that even if you let the loadings vary a little bit when you calculate the coefficient, that's why you have to have a factor analysis to calculate an omega, because you have to be able to adjust for these little differences in loadings. Alpha doesn't let you do that. You get largely the same answer. I mean, you would need dramatically different loading variability for your alpha and your omega to diverge. So that's the key difference. Sure, use omega. The best reason to use omega is because you probably have to do a factor analysis to use it. And one of the issues with alpha is that people use it when it's wildly inappropriate. They use it when they haven't checked the factor structure at all. They don't even know if they're measuring the same thing. Omega kind of forces you to think about that a little more because most software programs require you to do the factor analysis to get the omega. So in that way, it's good, but I'm not, surprised that you don't see wildly different results across an alpha and omega, especially when you mostly satisfied the assumptions. I hope that answers the question.
I'm sure it does. Very comprehensive. Thank you for that one. So we have a question here from Sarah. I am in epidemiology, and there has been a recent discussion on how, if at all, theory is used in epi or more broadly public health. Do you look at any of these issues outside of psych?
I don't work in public health at all, really, or epidemiology. The closest I get to that is kind of large scale education research, which I don't do as much anymore. But you can definitely, if you're working in a realm where there's a lot of large scale data collection with existing measures, you can often get, in the situation where that public health survey wasn't exactly what you wanted to measure. And I think that maybe they do a better job of acknowledging that than we do in psych. We do a lot of smaller studies with measures that we just made up. Whereas if you're in education or public health, you might have had some massive surveys, and then you look at the surveys. You see this in clinical psych a bit. You look at the surveys and you're like, oh, why'd they pick this survey? It's not very good, and that's something that you usually just have to clean up after the fact. I am reviewing a paper right now in prevention science about issues of measurement and transparency, which is a little more related to health. So I think that there's some rumblings going on over there as well.
Okay, the next one. Okay, right. Let me just take a look. So I'm just looking at the questions. So there were a couple, I think, on qualitative research, which is sometimes left out in the cold when it comes to sort of topics on open science or open research broadly. So I just want to give a bit of oxygen to that. So there's one here, which is, what is your advice on optimizing validity in studies that are trying to quantify qualitative measures?
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty in-depth discussion, and I did a qualitative study once. That's sort of my amount of expertise, but I think that a lot of qualitative researchers just have a fundamentally different philosophy of science than quantitative researchers. Quantitative researchers are measuring something that exists and it's real and it's reliable and it should generalize. Generating knowledge for all, whereas a lot of qualitative researchers have this idea that they're understanding this process in context right here, right now. And the idea of generalizing is different. Like there's just a fundamentally different approach. So I think that can interact or integrate with measurement validity in a way that's pretty complicated, especially if you start thinking about consistency and reliability. If that's not really the goal of your qualitative study, it's to describe what's happening right then. But there's a lot of transparency things that can be used in the qualitative research process to document, to be consistent, to check reliability, to make sure that if people are coding, two people are coding, that they came to the same decision and that those decisions were categorized with validity. If they put a name, this is something that in survey research we have to deal with a lot. We have some items and then we put a name on the variable and we say what it is. This happens in qualitative research too. You might have some concepts or ideas that were mentioned and you've coded them and then you put a name. The naming fallacy can occur there too. So I think you can justify theoretically and transparently some of those decisions just in the same way you would think through a quantitative measure, but you also might have some conflicts of philosophy of science where some of the goals are fundamentally different, and that could lead you to make different decisions in how you think about things.
Again, a wonderful comprehensive answer there, Jessica. There's two questions floating in the Q&A which are touching on power analysis, which you kind of touched on when you were talking about pre-registration, because obviously having an adequately powered study is really important. So the first one is one of the things missing in the discussion around how to about what makes a study adequately powered is the issue of measures we use. A noisy measure will undermine your power analysis. Do you agree, or am I way off base?
Yeah, reliability decreases, lack of reliability decreases power. So if you have more reliability, you'll have more statistical power. I think it's just one of those knobs. We make some assumptions when we do a statistical analysis, and it's that all of our measures are completely reliable. That's the assumption of the regression model, the ANOVA model, etc. Obviously, they're not. And so that's another knob that you can turn that'll like kind of chip away at statistical power. I do think that actually that prevention science paper that I'm reviewing right now, there's a simulation study in it that modifies the reliability of the scale to show how it changes the power to detect a replication effect. That's sort of the idea in the paper. And there is a paper about reliability, measurement reliability and replication by Andrew Gilman. So it's definitely a concern. I do think that it is ignored, and thoughtful power and sample size planning is in general an area where there's a lot of work to be done. Planning a study for poor reliability or trying to understand, get a good estimate of the reliability, especially when the original research may not have evaluated all the assumptions and calculated a reliability coefficient that means anything. This is like extra work you have to do as the researcher if you want to be really thoughtful about it. And low reliability can have a huge impact on power, even in more complicated models where you're taking care of that. I mean, the strength of the items, their loadings, and a factor analysis is a critical part of sample size determination. So I do agree that it's missing. I think there's a lot of work to be done there.
Great. And the second part to this question was a more kind of detailed question. Let me just find it. Okay, so it says, following on the power analysis, how would we be able to conduct accurate power analysis if Cronbach alpha was not provided? Also, should we conduct this separately for different groups? Should we do it average and say that this is the average reliability of the measure for both populations?
That's like an all the things question. Well,
Yeah.
so this hits on, I think, two issues. One is that you don't have adequate, so you want to do a study with a measure, you don't have adequate information about it to conduct, say you want to take into account reliability in your power analysis. You don't have adequate information to conduct the study. You also don't know if, I mean, you don't know a lot about the measure then. You know, you might not know if its factor structure is as stated. You might not know if it has any validity. So that's problematic. I think that one recommendation I give that I don't know if people like is that if you're planning a really big new study, whether it's a replication study or just another study, and the measure you want to use doesn't have a lot of validity or reliability information, like maybe take a step back and think about whether or not you need to collect a sample to get some of that information. I know that takes the process back a step further than you might have wanted to go. But in the case of you have multiple groups, if you have wildly different reliabilities across groups, that's some indication that you're not measuring the same thing across those groups. And you got a lot more to think about than just power in that case. And we see this is something that Leonie Kloos, who came to stay in my lab for 6 months and has sadly gone back now to Leuven to get her PhD. But we were looking at, and in the Mini Labs 2 paper that Mairead Shaw wrote, we were looking at reliability heterogeneity. And you definitely see this in large scale replications. And so we know power, even though power was calculated for each replication, because the translated versions vary in their reliability, and we know now that they vary in their measurement properties because we've analyzed them, that means you have differential power across each replicated sample. But you may also just have conceptual problems, like when you translated the measure into Portuguese, it didn't make any sense to them. So then what does your replicated effect mean? And it doesn't sound like you have translated versions, but if you've got big measurement differences across groups, you might have some conceptual differences across groups, and it may not make sense to compare them anyway. So that's all the things, lots to do for this person.
Okay, so we're past the hour. Jessica has kindly offered to sort of linger around for a bit. So I'll just probably just finish with one more question, which is, I think, potentially a gnarly one, but let's just see if we can unpack it. So are questionable measurement practices more relevant to confirmatory research, or is it problematic in exploratory research too, e.g. where perhaps it's okay to play around with your measures to come up with ideas to test in the future with a more rigorous approach? I think it's always okay to play around. Like, I think it's always okay to wander around in the garden of forking measurement paths. And a lot of people say this in response to exploratory versus confirmatory research, right? It's just the problem is that when you pass that off as if that's not what you did. So you like wandered around in the garden, you broke all your scales apart, you know, you're p-hacking or whatever, or, you know, reliability hacking, trying to figure out which subset of items would just get you to the like cutoffs that the editors wouldn't yell at you about. And you make it sound like that's not what happened. And so the readers calibrate your claims thinking that it was confirmatory. And you calibrate claims a lot differently if you think it was planned ahead versus then, well, I just did all possible things and this is what I found. You calibrate that claim a lot differently. You're like, oh, okay, go do that exact same thing again and let me know if you find the same thing. So it's not questionable if there aren't any questions. You know, so if you're like, this was an exploratory study, we analyzed, you know, items in all these different ways to find a subset of items that were really, they seemed to be the best. And it was very exploratory, this needs confirmation. That's totally fine. And that's actually quite common in scale development research to have replication of scales is quite common as in a scale development study. So, and I've written papers like this where you do a lot of, you know, you take items on, you take items off, you're like chasing the modification indices, you're looking to see what the reliability, you get a subset of items and then you say, okay, let's go use these items in another sample and make sure that we're getting some consistency. So I think that you're not questionable if you're just being transparent about what you did. You're just exploratory, and that's totally fine. Brilliant. I think that's a nice way to end. Explore as much as you like, so long as other people know that you explored is, I think, the nice take-home message there. Well, thank you, Jessica, for such a wonderful talk. A lot of positive feedback I've seen both on Twitter and in the Q&A. So it's great that you've made a wonderful contribution to the Riot series. Just before everybody peels off, please do check out the talk tomorrow by Stephen Cole, who will give a talk for the Rotterdam site for the Rights Club. So please check that out, and you can just find the link on the Twitter page, both for the KCR Rights Club, but also the Rotterdam one as well. And yes, until next time, keep on right sciencing.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.